Welcome to Third Floor Views, a production of Chesapeake Family Life, where we talk about health, education, and living with kids. I'm your host, Janet Jefferson. Today, we're talking about death. Joining us is Dr. Joey Nichols, MD, Master's in Public Health, Fellow of the American Academy for Family Physicians, board certified family physician with over 10 years of clinical experience, and founder of Canopy Family Care, which is a direct primary care practice in Tacoma Park, Maryland. And he is here to talk with us today about how to discuss death with kids, aging loved ones, and how to prepare for yourself. He also has an email course talking about death that won't kill you, launched this week. And so we're going to jump into that as well. So a huge thank you, Dr. Joey, for joining us today.
I'm so glad to be here, Janet.
To our viewers, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the comment section and we'll get to as many of those as we can. Dr. Joey, let's get started. So the first question is sort of just a big, broad one. And why is it important to talk about death to anyone, whether that be kids or loved ones, or even your family and partner?
That's a great question. Talking about death is one of the most loving things that you can do for the people in your life that you love. It's an unavoidable topic. It's going to come for all of us. It will happen to all of us. And it will be easier for your loved ones, especially your children, if you try to help them to understand death before it actually touches their life really closely. And if you talk about death calmly and routinely, then when it does happen to someone they love, because of course it will be less scary. They'll be able to process their feelings. They'll be able to deal with the fear and the grief that we all naturally have as normal responses to loss. And you'll have the opportunity to kind of set aside any misconceptions they may have about death that can create, if unaddressed, could create some anxiety or some other kind of emotional problems moving on. So again, it's a really beautiful gift you can give to your loved ones by having these conversations openly. It's not easy, but it's important.
Definitely. And I know that it's something that none of us have experienced. So therefore it's so foreign and maybe scary. But if it's something that we talk about and is bring into part of our culture, that maybe it's not so scary and it's not so foreign. So when it happens, you don't feel so blindsided. Let's talk about how to talk about this with kids, because they are such a specific group. So how do you do that? What do you recommend when you're dealing with parents, how to discuss death with kids? What do they actually need to know? Sort of what aspects are you going to share with them and what maybe are you going to hold back? And of course, this is going to vary on how old kids are, but how would you scaffold that for various kids?
Yeah, Janet, that's a really great point, because like with everything in pediatrics and child development, it's important to know what stage that your individual child is at. And your 6-year-old child may have been in a different place as a 3-year-old than your current 3-year-old, because every child progresses a little bit differently through those stages. And so that's sort of a general challenge that we have as parents, is learning from our children how to be the kind of parent that they need in this moment. So really the concept of death really begins very early in life, even at age 2, when they're barely having complete sentence. Even before they're having complete sentences, they're going to have some awareness of death. And at that sort of preschool era, age 2 to 6, the basic concept of death they're working with, your body stops working. That's how children are. That's about as emotionally mature as children can be about this. And so there's probably, if they have a habit of watching cartoon shows, the ones that are geared toward kids this age, sometimes depict characters who are pulverized, but then they rise up again and then shake it off and it's fine. Death isn't personal, it's not permanent, and they may have some magical thinking about death. They may believe, for instance, that if their loved ones die, they may continue to live in the sky, and in like a very literal sense, where if you're taking a family trip together, they'll be looking out the airplane window and wondering, like, hey, where's grandma, right? So that it's important to know that at that age, you want to give information in small bites and be very concrete. We'll talk about this more, I think, as we go, but it's very important to use words like Mr. Tom died. And to be very clear about that. Give it in small bites. Take your cues from your children as far as how much more information that they want to have. And as they at the tail end of the preschool years or the early school age years, those are those magical years where they're just asking all of the questions, right? And so by delivering that information in small bites, being very matter of fact, being very factual, it kind of really helps them to understand, hey, this is not a big deal, versus being really emotional and withdrawn, or worse, trying to skirt the topic or avoid it completely. Teaches kids that these are hard conversations, that we should avoid hard things, and we don't want that. So by the time you get into school age kids, ages 6 to 9, they have a different concept of death. They've gone beyond the body stops working phase, because where initially you would talk about, well, when somebody dies, their legs don't work anymore, they don't eat anymore, they don't talk anymore, their body stops working. At this more advanced age, kids are going to begin to recognize that all things will die. Things, anyway, not necessarily me. And they'll eventually reach this conclusion that death is irreversible. This is an age where you can start to point out examples of death, like, there's a bug on the sidewalk, the cicadas that we were all walking over this spring. That house plant, that mommy forgot to water. Or realistically, it's daddy that forgot to water it. Kids will develop that realization that all living things die. It's not a personal concept for them. They may also begin to associate things like ghosts, skeletons, inanimate objects. Some of the symbols that the culture they're raised in associate with death it starts to click. It starts to become salient. This is the age where, because if you ever went trick-or-treating and saw your 8-year-old freak out about like a scare from a haunted house on the street, and your 3-year-old is just blithely like, what?
Right.
Can kind of explain that. So at this age, children begin to learn that people who die don't come back. And but they haven't quite figured out that this is a universal thing, right? That happens with your older school age kids, ages 9 to 12. Their whole thing is death happens to everyone. And so they're going to develop a more advanced, realistic view of death as they're getting into middle school. They're no longer going to believe that they can escape death. Maybe that idea is going to dawn on them in some ways. With this new knowledge that death might happen to them, right? They begin to be really curious about death. They develop their own views. They may have what to adults seem like some morbid preoccupations, or really unusual interest in the spiritual aspects of death, or death in other cultures, music or art that seems to feature death prominently. That can be part of a normal developmental stage, and a way of them sort of dealing with this new knowledge that they have, which was pretty heavy for kids to take on for the first time. And by the time they're teenagers, there's this interesting paradox about teenagers, because they're finally at the developmental stage of they get that on some level, death will happen to me. And some of them, unfortunately, don't have the judgment to link their immediate actions with the risk of death. And so they appear to, they can engage in some risky behaviors, not really thinking, oh yeah, no, I definitely could have died with that. Oops. All right. Right. So that's another issue of developing executive function. But that's sort of they're kind of at that level as teenagers, where usually they have the kind of the sophistication that we might expect from an adult in some cases. And however, again, that teenagers have a lot of big feeling. We all do at all ages, but teenagers especially can seem to have really big feelings, and they have this other developmental task of trying to establish some autonomy, find their own identity. And to do that, they sometimes have to kind of systematically dismantle everything that we love and stand for in order to arrive at their own conclusions. And then, when you mix grief and loss into that, you can get some sort of strange results. But again, sorting out what's developmentally appropriate and what's outside the range, can sort of be helpful. And the spoiler alert is a lot of the really big feelings, uncomfortable conversations, even some of the acting out behaviors might be reasonably expected. It's important to just kind of meet your kids where they're at and try to understand where they're coming from as much as you can, to be patient, break it into small bites, to validate, to normalize. Hey, it's okay to have big feelings around death. It's okay to cry with your kids. It's recommended. We'll get through all of it. All of us will get through this together, because we have no other choice.
So true. I think some of the stuff that you're saying is actually really comforting too, because there's so many times when you look at your child's behavior and you're like, ooh, is that normal? That seems really strange. And then it's saying, listening to you say, oh, some of this fixation over death or interest or diving in or pushing back. That's really comforting to hear, I'm sure, for many parents, that a lot of these behaviors are absolutely normal. And it's just our job as parents to find the best way to support them and help them understand what's going on, at the right age and stage for them.
Mhm.
What would you recommend if you have kids who are struggling with this idea of death? I mean, it's something we all struggle with on some level, I think, but if you really have kids stuck in one spot, whether they're fixated or they're really struggling with sadness, what do you recommend if there is a child that is having a hard time?
Well, I think it's important to know the warning signs that are going to help you tell the difference between a child that's grieving in an age appropriate way
Hmm.
and maybe there's something else going on, like a mental health issue or a kind of a social concern, or something deeper that needs to be looked into more clearly. So anytime your child is having issues with sleep, eating, school, the basic stuff,
Hmm.
or vague physical symptoms like headaches or belly pain that just don't add up,
Hmm.
that could be a sign of a bigger problem. Sometimes it shows up as anxiety in school that wasn't previously present, doesn't have an apparent trigger, or anxiety around bedtime.
Hmm.
A lot of
Hmm.
young kids, especially if there's language used around death about, oh, grandma went to sleep and she's not going to wake up again, begin to wonder, well, could that happen to me?
Right, right.
So that may trigger some anxiety around sleeping at bedtime, panic attacks, extreme outbursts of anger,
Hmm.
withdrawing from friends or activities that they used to enjoy, um, nightmares or night terrors or other kind of sleep disorders that
Hmm.
were kind of changing or not present previously. If they are sort of blunted, if they don't show the same range of emotions that they used to show,
Hmm.
um, that would be concerning. And then for your older children, your young adults participating in activities like substance abuse, promiscuity, vandalism, theft, aggressive behavior, those kind of acting out type behaviors. Certainly all things that you would be looking into anyway, but in the context of grief, I mean, these are not normal features of
Hmm.
grief. So that
Hmm.
that deserves a little bit more attention. And then at that point, I think it's always a good first step just to try to level with your children, right? And say,
Hmm.
hey, this is what I'm seeing. What's going
Hmm.
on with you?
Hmm.
And depending on the age, it may be developmentally appropriate for them to completely blow you off and say, I have nothing to do with you or this conversation. Fine.
Right.
You know, but helping them to find someone that they can trust and confide in and talk with, a school counselor, a minister, a psychologist, trusted family member. I mean, it's important to recognize, and there's nothing to be ashamed of. Like if we're not always and only the best person to help our children with the problems that they're having.
Right,
Um,
right.
yeah.
So true. What would you recommend if maybe a loved one or a family member dies and parents are trying to figure out what's the best way to help a child mourn in a healthy way,
Mhm, mhm.
whether this be as a whole family or specifically the child individually?
Well, remember, kids are going to progress through their development stages at different rates.
Hmm.
And so you may have, if you have multiple children of different ages, some of them may seem actually kind of unbothered by the death of a loved one. Others on the other end of the spectrum could be highly emotional. And even within a given developmental age, every child's going to handle death differently. And so I don't have like a playbook for you.
Right.
There's no way to make this easy. Like we're gonna break death down into 7 easy steps, right? And it's also important to recognize, like if you remember from your psychology undergraduate classes, like there's Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's like the stages of grief,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
for those of us like busy type A parents who have, kind of growing in our professional roles, and then we've got kids that are forming their own identities, and we've got them in 17 sports, and then meanwhile we're taking care of our aging parents. Those of us type A sort of people may want to feel this temptation to schedule our stages of grief. So I'm going to do anger. I'm going to do denial for a week, right? And then I'm going to give myself a
Right.
couple of weeks of anger, and then I'm going to get to this bargaining thing. I'm not excited about the depression. I'll try to get that out of the way over the long weekend, and then I'll get to
Yes,
this
yes.
acceptance thing, and 6 easy weeks, right?
Yeah,
This is how we
absolutely.
And that's not how grief works at all, right? Grief is erratic. You bounce back and forth between these. There's a lot of complex emotions that go on with grief, and kids really aren't all that different in a sense. It's not like smaller people have proportionately smaller sized emotions.
Right.
Spend any time with a toddler, you realize it's definitely not the case.
Absolutely.
So what can we do to help them mourn in a healthy way? It's not so different than how we would help adults in some ways. I mean, but the thing to remember is that it's very important, especially for your younger kids, not to try to pull punches or sugarcoat things. Like, it's not helpful for you to tell them, he's living in the sky now. He went to sleep forever. He passed away. Well, what does that mean? Right. To a kid, it's very important to use words like grandma died. Her body stopped working. We're not going to see her anymore. And you want to give them very understandable information about grief, the feelings you're having. I feel that way too. It's normal to feel that way because we really loved grandma and we're going to miss her. You want to give them reassurance that they're going to have their needs met, right? So I'm not going to leave you. Someone will always take care of you. Even if something bad did happen to me, someone would always be there to take care of you. There's tempting in some cultures to try to hide the fact of death or impending death from children. Why burden them with that? But for a lot of children, just like a lot of adults, it's important to offer them the opportunity to say their goodbyes or to participate in memorials. And that's a very individualized decision about what that looks like. But trying to pretend like the death is not happening, or we're going to, I'm dealing with my own grief, and so I don't have time to deal with theirs. So I'm going to just, put that on the back burner for now, and we'll tell them what happened later. It could probably create more problems later on than it's going to solve in the short term.
Right.
Yeah. And then you could ask them what are their own individual thoughts and opinions about death. I think that's important. We don't do that enough. And so kind of understanding, checking in with your child to see like where are they coming from and how are they thinking through this gives you an opportunity to respond to their specific concerns without feeling like you're having to lecture. And also helps you to correct any misconceptions they may have about death and dying.
Yeah. I think those are all such important things to remember. I think especially maybe in American culture, we do want to protect our children and shelter them from some of these conversations that we feel are challenging. And it's important to remember is that you're sort of undermining yourself as a parent if you do that, because it's just going to come back and bite you in the butt later. So be brave.
Three big things definitely three big things you definitely don't want to do, right? The first one is we talked about this a little bit. It's those euphemisms like passed on, passed away, went on to a better place, went to their eternal rest. They're sleeping forever. They went to live with God. Because your 3-year-old might say, "Oh, they went to live with God. God's their new roommate. When can I visit?"
Right.
When is she going to bring God by? Can we have lunch sometime? Right. And I'm not trying to make trivialize anybody's religious beliefs. If kids have been from a very young age taught to rely on those beliefs for comfort, then that's something they can lean on. But if you're only introducing these in the context of death, it's just not going to work if that isn't something that's already been put in place for them. And those words like gone to heaven or God took your family member are going to be frightening if they're unfamiliar with that, especially the younger kids. Or if you say, Aunt Susan went away. Again, they may become fearful that when their loved ones go away on vacation or to the store down the street, they're never going to return. So it's always a safe bet to use very specific language like, Aunt Susan died. Another cause for confusion, if you say, "Oh, Aunt Susan got very sick and so her body stopped working," she got sick and died. At various developmental stages, children may not be able to recognize there's different kinds of sick, right? I just feel bad or I don't.
Right.
And so in their minds, they might think that all illnesses can lead to death. And so they get a mild cold and immediately that's where their curiosity will go, "Oh, I'm going to die," right? And it's an oversimplification, but it's important to be upfront about that. So, we have to find a way, if we're talking about sickness and death, we have to explain that there's only some diseases that cause people to die. Don't assume that they're automatically going to realize that. And that it's important to explain to them, especially the younger children, like just because you're sick doesn't mean that you're going to die. Just because you have cancer these days doesn't mean that you're automatically going to die.
Right.
Many people will get sick. Sometimes they'll live a very long time and have a very good life for many years while they're sick. Sometimes they get better. But just immediately defaulting to, oh, they're sick and died, can cause some problems. And then the final really big mistake that people make, I think, I mean, there's many, but the big three, is saying, oh, Aunt Susan died, but that's okay because she was very old. And what we don't want is for kids to have this misconception that only old people die. It can give you a false sense of security about death. And unfortunately, death is a thing that could happen to any of us. I could be hit by a meteor tomorrow, right? And you wouldn't want them, if they then experience the death of a younger person, a cousin or classmate, heaven forbid, like you wouldn't want them to become distrustful of life in general. So people of all ages die, right? It's important that they recognize that. And it's important to reassure them that they will live a long life, probably, if they take good care of their body and they make good choices.
Yeah, those are very concrete pieces of advice. And I think it's helpful to have that too, when you as an adult are also grieving and can get lost in in sort of what you're dealing with your own emotions. So thinking about that, shifting a little bit away from kids and more into adults, when do you recommend that adults start talking to each other about their end of life choices and preferences? Is this something like, okay, I'm, 70 years old, let's have this conversation, let's make sure I get it in my will? Or, is this something like, okay, I'm 20 or I'm 18 and I'm leaving the house, I'm officially an adult, these are things I need to be thinking about? What would you recommend to your clients?
What a great question, Janet. So it's like the old saying goes, the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. The second best time to plant a tree is today. Yeah. And I'm not trying to imply, oh, hang up can't turn off the Facebook, call your mother and immediately say, we need to talk about death, Mom, because all of us are going to die.
Right.
It's probably not a great strategy for most families anyway. But it's important that we have these conversations soon. And before you feel comfortable is a good rule of thumb, because if you wait until just everything is perfect and you feel completely prepared and completely comfortable, that's probably never going to happen realistically. So you have to get to the point where you can feel just uncomfortable enough that you can just kind of like push yourself into it, I think is a totally reasonable thing. And it's going to be awkward. There's no way to just sort of nail the landing on this for anybody. It's not going to, if you're doing it right, it's probably not going to feel good. But if you have that expectation, then it maybe when you're feeling naturally some reluctance to have these conversations, if your fight or flight, kind of gets, if you feel like the hair is standing up to the back of your neck, or if it's just not going exactly the way you pictured, or it's a little bit more awkward than you recognize, you can just sort of take 3 deep breaths and recognize, no, this is one of the most difficult types of conversations you can have in life. And, and it's difficult but it's important, right? That's what's one of the things that one of the reasons we know it's so important is how difficult it is. So I guess as soon as that you can. So just like with your children, these opportunities come up if you're driving down the road and there's some roadkill, or, if you have the dead house plan, if you go out of your way to find like children's books that deal with topics around death or dying and add that to your bedtime reading rotation, they don't have to be morbid, right? But they can just pose the question. Then the same thing with your older parents, because again, it can happen at any age. You don't have to wait for a diagnosis like cancer or dementia. Some people try to make an event out of this. You're already gathered around the Thanksgiving or the Rosh Hashanah table, right? So if there's some big family gathering, could be a really great opportunity to have just sort of real and sort of vulnerable conversations, if that works in your family unit. For other family units, that ain't going to fly, right? And so you may need to have these more intimate one-on-one conversations. Maybe it comes up as a plot point in a movie. Maybe there's this article that you just read in the newspaper. Maybe there's an aside, if your mother's favorite, artist, singer, some notable person dies. There's all kinds of kind of indirect excuses that we can leverage, just opportunities that come up on a weekly basis that we could use to start that conversation. We don't have to wait for the right time because it will never come.
Right. Absolutely. What would you suggest to someone who's trying to maybe talk to an older parent? So you feel like I need to know what my parents want to do when they pass away, when they die. What would you say if that conversation is a struggle and the older individual is avoiding it or not really, or, blowing you off in some way? How would what are some things that you would say, hey, this is important because, or like, I'm doing this because, I'm not just saying that you're old and you're going to die and, we need to get this covered, but like, this is a really important conversation to have. Like, how would you frame that?
Yeah, so the magical words that you can say to your mother or father to get them to have the conversation about death, even though they're totally reluctant to, are as follows. No, sorry, kidding. It doesn't. Yeah. Wouldn't that be cool? No,
that would be amazing.
Yeah, no, I don't have that. Unfortunately, I don't have that. I don't think that exists. I think that it's important, just like with your kids, it's important to be patient. And they may not want to have this conversation today. They may not be ready, but if they're not ready to engage in that conversation, the whole point of having it is so that you can understand their wishes. They may have no idea what they want, and it wouldn't be a productive conversation if they can't show up to that conversation ready to give you, like some useful information. So, you can just try to take those first steps. You can say, Mom, here's what I came up with for mine. Right. Because if you have the ability to think through that yourself, even if you're, 30, 40, 50 years younger than your parents, right. That may demonstrate to them, hey, this is really important. And maybe it wasn't all that hard. And hey, I want some similar things, but I also want different things. That's one really useful strategy is for you to, kind of go first.
Right. Right.
Or another is to just sort of, if there's other friends or family in their lives where maybe it didn't go so well, we can kind of point, like, I really don't want what happened to Aunt Susan to happen to you. Right. And I understand you may not be ready to have that conversation today, but that problem's not going to go away. Right. So someday we're going to have to, so what would it take for us to have that conversation? Right. I think can be really powerful. And if you ever do find like the 6 magic words, then, please let me know.
Absolutely. I'll pass that along. But it sounds like at the very least, plant the seed. And so you can get them thinking about it. So maybe you can have that conversation in the near future.
Yeah. Absolutely.
What would you recommend as a first step? Like, okay, I'm ready to make these decisions, or I'm ready to have these conversations. And I've come up with these choices. What would you recommend? Okay, now you need to do this. Now you need to have this documented in a will, or now you need to tell these people. What are some tangible things that actually need to be in place, and who needs to know about it?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. So the basic decisions you need to make about end of life are, first of all, who do you want to have act as your healthcare agent? Because the healthcare agent, if you don't specify somebody else in a living will kind of document or medical power of attorney, the doctor, if you're unable to express your wishes, the doctor is going to turn to your next of kin and say, okay, what are we going to do here? Right. If that person says, I can't make that decision, and nobody else is available, you may have a doctor that you've never met deciding how you spend the last moments of your life. They may not guess right. Right. I wouldn't trust myself to make that, even for patients I know well. When patients experience these near-death events where there was no one available and the doctors make the decision, some of these patients get better and they wake them up and they ask them, what did you want us to do here? And it's really interesting because it's like a coin flip. It's literally like 50-50. Do the doctors guess correctly or don't they? Right. So I could have known you for a decade as your doctor and had no clue. Right. Right. So very important that you write your wishes down, and you can't anticipate every potential scenario. So you can't write a detailed, like 300-page playbook manual or whatever. It's just not how it works. And so in the absence of that, you've got to have someone whose judgment you trust, who makes good decisions under pressure, who doesn't get too emotional about it, who understands your wishes. It may not be your spouse or your best friend or your next of kin. The person that you designate as your healthcare agent may not be obvious, but it can be really important in terms of you having your wishes followed through with. And then you got to think through, what kind of medical treatment would you actually want or not want? And if you're not like super familiar with life support and medical treatment, if what you know about the end of what you see, like shows like Grey's Anatomy, it might be useful to talk to your doctor about what does dialysis really mean? When we intubate somebody, like what's that process? Like break down the different kinds of life support and what the implications are for those, so that you can understand them now when it isn't an emergency,
right?
Versus have some very busy doctor kind of slide into your intensive care unit bed and sort of ask your family, well, you want us to do everything, don't you?
Right, right.
Right. It's going to maybe generate a very different outcome than what you would have expected or chosen had you thought about it beforehand.
Mm-hmm.
And you want to think about, like, how would you like to be kept comfortable? And my wife has this thing about like the bed sheets, alive or dead, it's my responsibility to make sure that she's never stuck someplace with like the sheets tucked into the end of the bed because her feet can't be free or something. So this is great for me because I haven't had to make a bed in years. But we all probably, if we think about that, we've got these little preferences about like how would you want to be cared for that are really important to us, that we can easily write those things down and make that happen for ourselves if we plan ahead a little bit. And there's even deeper social, emotional, spiritual needs. Do you want to be visited by a minister? Do you want your friends to come and say goodbye? Do you not want to say goodbye? Do you want to record a video? Do you want an Elvis tribute artist? I mean, there's any number of things that you may want to have present for you at the end of your death. And if you think ahead, maybe you can join in on some of the fun if you're lucky.
Right.
Versus just have it happen. And then everyone kind of wonder like, what should we do here? On that note, how would you like to be remembered?
Mm-hmm.
Would it be important for you? Do you want to have your name on a park bench?
Mm-hmm.
Is there some tradition that your friends can do to honor you that you could have a hand in creating? You can be as creative as you want with that. And then finally, what do you want your loved ones to know? And this is really important, Janet. There's this great book called The 4 Things That Matter Most. And it talks about the 4 conversations you want to have with somebody toward the end of life. But really, it's the subtitle of this book is actually Conversations for a Good Life, not a good death, because these are probably all things that are hard conversations we should be having with everybody all the time. They are, number 1, please forgive me. Number 2, I forgive you. Number 3, thank you. And number 4, I love you. And, and if you are all the people that are really close to you in your life, if you've had these 4 conversations, if you're up to date with the 4 things that matter most, again, you could be hit by a meteor tomorrow and, you'll have left you'll have left them in a good place. And so but that's another thing that we can, if we have the luxury of having a little bit of foreknowledge about our death coming, which is increasingly likely in the world that we live in now, then those are conversations that we can get started on today. So there's an example of how thinking about death can help us to lead a better life.
So simple, but so powerful. I have one last question for you before we let you go, is just if you could speak a little bit about your new email course that's come out in terms of talking about death and how to make some of these hard choices and hard conversations.
Thank you, Janet. I've helped hundreds of patients over the years deal with these issues in their family. I've had to deal with this in my own family. I've had some of my grandparents die with hospice and some without. And I've seen the difference that good end-of-life care and conversations among family members can make. So I want to invite everybody. You can go on the resource page, I think, from this episode and find a link to sign up for this email course. Talking About Death Won't Kill You, where you'll receive a series of emails, one every weekday for 5 days. That kind of walks you through this process step by step, helps you get your own affairs in order. And once you're able to do that for yourself, I think you'll find it's a lot easier to have these conversations with other people and maybe get other members of your family who are on the fence about this to be a little bit more curious and kind of meet you halfway. There's also a list of children's books by age group about death and dying that you'll be able to find, I think, on the resources page on your site, which I highly recommend if you're looking for some resources, some unemotional, accessible ways to bring up these topics with kids at various ages.
That's really, really helpful. I think, we're always looking as parents for more resources, whether it be for our kids ourselves or our parents. So all of that is tremendously useful. And then can people sign up for your email course at any time?
It's a great question. That's right. It's an evergreen offer for the first 100 people that sign up. I'm giving free access to a really great resource called 5 Wishes, which is at fivewishes.org. I don't have any financial relationship with them, but this is it's a document that in the state of Maryland, if you go through all of the steps and have it properly signed and witnessed, will serve as a legally valid end of life document, power of attorney for you.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, normally, I really want to encourage people to sign up for the course, get your free access to the 5 Wishes, or you can go to fivewishes.org and download a copy for yourself or a friend or a family member.
That's fantastic. Well, thank you so much to Dr. Joey Nichols for all of this great information about how to talk about death. Thank you also to all of our viewers and listeners today for joining us on this conversation. Make sure that you visit ChesapeakeFamily.com for up-to-date local information on home, health, and living for today's Maryland parent. This episode will be archived on ChesapeakeFamily.com in both video and podcast format, and all of those resources that Dr. Joey listed will be up there as well for you to access. I'm Janet Jefferson with Chesapeake Family Life and Third Floor Views. Thank you so much.